welcome to the Understanding Projects podcast. My discussion today is with Robert Mansour. Robert has extensive experience in delivering successful multi-million-dollar projects in the commercial, industrial, retail, and oil and gas segments. His experience also includes contract management and negotiations, risk management, coordination of engineering, procurement, and quality monitoring and control. Our discussion focused on the application of risk management within physical projects, such as construction or within the nuclear industry. As Robert explains, while risk is sometimes challenging to quantify in certain virtual projects, such as software development, this is not the case in physical projects. The application of sound risk management to these projects is absolutely essential. Here is Robert Mansour. So today's topic, we're going to be talking about project risks, and I think a special focus in an area that I think you know well is risks that take place in the physical world. Let's say construction or more heavy industry projects and that type of thing. And so I guess my first question is, how do you see risk management varying from, say, other software projects like a software project or digital projects? So, do they vary? Does it vary, or if so, how does it vary?
Yeah, I think risks in what we would call the physical risks or the inherent risks or apparent risks are obvious because they're there and you can almost kind of see it or be able to visualize it, whereas risks in a software atmosphere or even a risk in a manufacturing atmosphere, it's there and you know what you need to look for, but it might not be as obvious. And the example I want to give here is risks when you're on a construction site. Could be in different forms, such as, the physical injury is kind of the obvious one here, or the risk of weather elements. Those are risks that are, those are the ones that you can actually kind of picture and you can see and you work around those. And a lot of times in my planning, when I'm doing a construction project, specifically outdoors, you think about those environmental risks, for example, weather, winter construction, summer construction, and you're always planning for those. You're putting your contingencies in. Obviously, those are going to be the ones that you'll have to accept and you'll have to plan for those. So you know that you're going to get hit with a winter storm. You know you're going to get hit with excessive rain where you can't pour concrete or you can't do a specific task because that risk is there, and that risk can be planned for, or you can have the contingency for it as you plan your project. Whereas risk in the software, you don't have the elements, you don't have that, but there are similarities though. And I was putting some thought into this. You can have kind of the manpower issues, the manpower risks. You can, maybe someone's having a bad day, a programmer is having a bad day, a laborer is having a bad day, and you might not get the same quality of product. So those are the similarities of risks that you can also plan for. So you have the elements and you have the manpower risks.
Yeah, I know when I'm teaching about risk management, I usually find myself going to the physical types of projects as I will start to, even though I'm not an expert on construction, I can certainly imagine what the risks are. You can start to talk about, walls falling over, or workers getting physically hurt by something, and it makes the risks very real. So then students will understand what they are. As you say, compared to, say, if it's a software project or other types of business projects, people don't get directly hurt by them. Now, there can be people hurt down the road, that if you implement a software product that has a bug that doesn't work in a certain situation, at some future point a user will be using it and someone could get hurt, but it's theoretical at that point. It's a risk on a risk sort of thing, as opposed to on a construction project, there's somebody laying there having just been hurt, and it's so obvious and apparent. So I do use sort of construction examples just to get the point across.
Yeah, and I think we tend to move in that direction because we all take calculated risks every day in our lives, and I think we can conceptualize that a lot better, because crossing the road or driving a car, making that left turn, we're always copying that risk, and it's a physical risk. And when we go and teach that risk piece of it, it's also there, it's visible to see. And you drive by a construction site, and I like using this example a lot. You're driving by a construction site, you see physically the people on site, you see the cranes, you see all these different things that could go wrong. So you can conceptualize that risk a lot and compute it a lot better than, as you said, a what if risk. What if there is that bug or that patch, or that someone can hack down the road. So I think using that construction risk and that physical example really helps drive the point on what are risks. And people don't necessarily equate that with project planning very well until you actually bring it up, and you're like, we actually do this. Like, we plan for these things. When that crane gets on site, we planned for the potential risks. When that very heavy piece of equipment gets on that site, or material gets on that site that we have to hoist, that's a big risk. So it's there, but we don't always equate it to project management until you bring it up and you use it as that correlation, that example.
Yeah, and it's interesting when you just a few minutes ago, when you were talking about the risk is every day of just going on the highway, or driving to school or to workplace or so on. I've used that example as well, and it is true. It's all around us. We do learn to process it, in our everyday lives. And it's just applying that into the work world. So what process do you use? Like, if we focus in on a construction site, do you specifically go into risk mode, or is it just inherent in the fact that everything you're doing on that site has got risk attached? So is it just attached to everything you do has a little bit of a risk component?
Yeah, informally, it is inherent. We're always thinking about risks. I had the opportunity to work in oil and gas, and I currently work in the nuclear space, and you always have that on your mind. You always have what if kind of in your head, but we also formalize it. And I tend to drive that conversation around risk and safety hand in hand. So we talk about it, we develop that risk register, and we have those risk triggers to ensure that we are aware that what risks could be happening in different parts of the schedule as we're moving through the execution of the project. But as you said, kind of, is it in the back of our mind? It's always in the back of our mind when we're doing anything. When you're on site, you're always looking around, you're always kind of head on a swivel to make sure that you're aware of what's going on around you, especially in high sensitive areas, such as being inside that nuclear power plant. You're looking around, there's valves, there's pipes, there's things that you don't want to mess around with. So there's that project risk, and then there's also that personal risk of being sure that you're not going to cause any residual risks or any secondary
Yeah.
risks as we
Yeah.
move along.
Yeah. No, I know what you mean of you know, the existence of a risk register doesn't mean you don't have to think about risk anymore on a day-to-day basis, because I'm interested to explore that a little bit further, of the risk register within a nuclear plant, or within a big construction site, of what's in there and how detailed it becomes. But no matter how detailed it is, it can't possibly match reality. It can't, it's a summarization, an estimation of what things, of the infinite number of possibilities. Here's some of them, and what we're going to do. So, but that doesn't alleviate the need to have, you mentioned, your head on a swivel, of you're always looking around, you're always, that mental calculator is always thinking,
Yeah.
what could go wrong? That crane doesn't quite look right, or they're the person who's getting into it, is that a new person who could introduce a risk? So, the risk man, like the risk manager, or the person who is really on top of it, will be calculating those sort of things.
Yeah, no, when you're in that boardroom and you're developing that risk register, you have the mental limitations of what that risk looks like, or what it could be, or we're cross-referencing with that schedule and saying, okay, or these activities, and saying what risk could be coming out of these activities. And that's what we talk about in theory, and that's what we talk about in the boardrooms, which works really well, so we can see the bigger picture, and so we can ensure that we have the proper contingencies, both schedule and budget, to cover that if that happens. But as you alluded to, Dave, is that when you're out there, you're also calculated. You're also looking at different things. You're also looking at how that person is working. And I spoke about it earlier. The quality of the people working on that job, it's not necessarily the quality of the person, but their mindset at that time. They could be having a bad day. They could be in a personal issue, and
Yep.
it translates to their work and their state of mind while they're out there. We put a lot of emphasis on lifting and hoisting, for example, material, and looking at the straps that are hoisting it. That's not in our risk register, but
Mhm.
it is something when we're on site, you're looking at that. You're looking for any kind of tears. You're looking for anybody that's not paying attention. So that there's a risk that's on site that we look at beyond that risk register.
Yeah.
We do as much as we can to develop that risk register as best as possible. And, we sit there, but again, that mental limitation or capacity, or that perceived risk that we can visualize, is limited in that boardroom. But when we get on site, it's a whole new game.
Yes. Yeah. Because of the variables that you just mentioned a few of them, of just, even you said the person, it could be they maybe didn't get a lot of sleep last night. They maybe are having a personal issue. They may be disgruntled. They might be, there's a myriad of things that will vary away from the probability and so on that was established in the risk register. So what, in that boardroom, who's there? Like who's at the table that is talking about the risks of this project that you're working on?
Yeah, a lot of time, it, there's an emphasis, and early on in my career, I felt like I was responsible for the risk register. I was responsible for identifying the risks and figuring out the plans, because I didn't want to bother the other team members or subject matter experts or stakeholders, because I felt they had other things to do.
Right.
And
And
I'm
you
the
being
project
the
manager.
project, you being the project manager.
Yes, that
Okay.
is correct. Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
for clarifying. Yeah. So as a project manager, I felt that I needed to kind of take it on and drive it and be able to and be responsible for it. But as I moved along, the reality is the project manager is not the expert of everything. Most of the time they have limited knowledge of they can see the overarching project, but they have limited knowledge of the specifics. So when I'm in that room, I'm inviting anybody and everybody that I can get my hands on. The project team members that are going to be helping me execute the project, stakeholders. I try to get a wide array of stakeholders, and then the subject matter experts. And I work as a facilitator, and that's kind of where I live. I try not to influence the ideas. I try not to give people the thoughts, at the beginning and while we're developing it. As we get more into the details, I ask the questions, or I try to drive the conversation a certain way to develop the, further risks, or the residual risks as we move along. But yeah, it's a tough thing, because the expectation is a project manager is responsible for all of these plans, and they're the ones that have to drive it. But in reality, we have limited knowledge as a project manager, so we need those subject matter experts in that room to help us develop those.
Yeah, more heads are better than one on this. What's the reaction of the team members and stakeholders? Are they yeah, let's go to that meeting, or is there like why are we doing this, or what do you do in those situations?
Yeah, every meeting there's hesitation, obviously, because we have way too many meetings on our plate, as we already have, right? So as we move along, so I think the realization of a successful project requires a whole team is starting to become more, I don't want to say common knowledge, but it's a better understanding that we're not going to succeed unless the whole team is involved, and the whole team has to help out to succeed. So I've gotten pretty good response, and I've been doing project management for quite a long time now, and as I moved on, and you get into that larger complex projects, you're getting more involvement. You're getting more people that are coming to the table and are willing to participate. Again, you have, I don't want to say the people that want to hold you back and the people that are complaining, but there's always those people, and you kind of have to learn to work with them and deal with them and drive out the information to get because they might have great insight, and they might be another meeting, but for the most part everybody's cooperative, and everybody comes in with the ideas and tries to kind of assist in the development of that register.
And hopefully too, that after they've been involved in a while, they start to realize that these are not theoretical things that never happen. They're not, these impossibilities. They are things that happen, and they see them happen. A good example, just a simple example, is in one of my student teams. They were running an event, and one of the things that we talked about in their risk register was technology, of setup of technology, of projectors and things. And what I mentioned is that these things tend not to work when you're in a new environment and so on. And they were just telling me, and they were very receptive, so they weren't resisting the whole idea. But when the event itself actually occurred, they came and said, yes, sure enough, we spent about 3 hours on getting it working before the event, because they were on top of it, and so that was a good lesson, that had they just waited till 5 minutes before the event and plugged it in and then nothing, they would have just, had a, again, not as serious a problem as, a construction site risk, but nonetheless, it would have impaired their event. So, some of that, if team members get to see the fact that these things do happen, then they become more accepting of the process, I think.
Yeah. I agree 100% with that. And I think a lot of people on construction sites have seen the near misses. Like, thank God that, there's a lot of emphasis on safety and risk mitigation. It's very different from 20, 30, 50 years ago, in terms of safety. And, back in the day, a lot of the risk data that was collected was a passive risk collection. Now there's a huge emphasis on trending issues, near misses, or repeat issues that have happened. So now we're looking at the trends, and we're trying to use those trends as a risk, as an input to our risk register, input to a risk conversation. So we're not looking at everything, what happened on site or what could happen. It's what is possibly going to happen. Where are we heading? A couple of tools dropped in the same location. Okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to mitigate that risk? A couple straps came in that were worn out. And that's a trend. It didn't happen. The risk didn't happen, but we saw that risk, and there was a risk. And I use that in my risk triggers. Actually, if we see a trend, let's start reacting before it happens. So and we have a contingency budget to buy better straps, or have a contingency budget to have tools with straps on them, so people are wearing them around the wrist if they're working at heights or whatever. So we look at those trends and we try to mitigate it before it happens.
Yeah. Tell me about the risk register. One of the things that is always there is, how do you quantify? When you're talking about a risk, one of the dimensions is probability. How likely on your projects, do you go more down the qualitative high, medium, low approach, or more of the quantitative of attempting to assign a number to them? Like, what do you do in that regard?
Yeah, for the most part, I use kind of a hybrid method between the qualitative and quantitative analysis. So we kind of interchange the high, medium, low with the numbers, and even moving it to a dollar amount. So if this potentially happens, it could cost whatever, multiply it by the probability, and get that number. How many weeks is it going to cause on that schedule if it happens, and multiply it. So we use kind of a hybrid approach to it. If it is a larger, more complex project, there is obviously the Monte Carlo situation, but we don't run into that very often. And most of the time, with the people in the room, it's a lot easier to explain the hybrid method than it is to explain a pure qualitative or pure quantitative analysis, or even try to take it further to that Monte Carlo simulation. So I think it works for me personally as a project manager. The most effective way is that hybrid method, and trying to quantify. And I use best practices. I don't ask the team to try to put a number together. I find that would cause a lot of confusion, a lot of conversation that we don't need. So I come in there after either I use what my PMO kind of asks us to use, or something that historically has been used that's worked to be able to provide that probability and impact.
Yeah, I find probability is probably an easier one to work with. Like, I think we're probably better equipped to say, okay, given this, if we can narrow it down to a specific thing, what are the odds? And I think we're pretty good at that. Yeah. We can distinguish between 1 in 1,000 and 1 in 100 and 1 in 10. We can kind of pick one of those. Impact, I think, is where things get more difficult. In that, well, how bad will it be? That to me, that just seems harder. I don't know if you found that too, or agree or disagree.
I think with the construction industry, you kind of can, again, outside of the last 3 years, it's
Yeah.
probably easier to predict. Like, okay, if if this piece of equipment does it, or this piece of material doesn't come in, what kind of impact does that have on the project? Is it 2 weeks, 3 weeks? How about cost? So we can kind of do a rough order of magnitude on the cost, depending on how many people are supposed to be working on that activity, for how long, based on the schedule, and kind of put that as a rough order of magnitude cost. So I think it's not as difficult on a construction site,
Yeah.
to provide the impact, because you're basing it on historical information, you're basing it on a trend, because when you're receiving material, typically they'll tell you the number of week delay if it's going to be delayed. So you can take that number and figure it out in your schedule, multiply it by the impact or the probability, which is high, and then take that and use that as
Yeah.
a contingency. Obviously the last 3 years kind of has been an anomaly, because things have, supply chain issues and, the pandemic have caused a real skewed information. So it's really hard to predict it now, but it's starting to get better and we're starting to trend in the right direction again. But
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, that is true. I hadn't thought of that too, of the impact on a physical project where there are, known amounts of time to, if you mess up the concrete, setting
Yeah.
and so on, you have to rip it out and put it back in. That's a known cost. Like
Yeah.
that is historical in nature. So there are more metrics perhaps than, what's the cost of a, of choosing the wrong technology for a software project. What's the impact of that? It's so, like, I don't know, like that it's big, so it's
Yeah.
it's gonna hurt, that's where maybe things get difficult. Here's a tough question. and I don't know if it's possible, but you mentioned Monte Carlo simulation.
Yeah.
Is that, can you provide, just for the listeners and viewers, what is Monte Carlo simulation, and what does that do for you?
So I'll try to explain it as best as I can. So it kind of takes your schedule and your uncertainty of, so a lot of the times we get a schedule and it has a fixed date or a fixed duration. 5 days to pour concrete, or 10 days for to build this wall or whatever. But we don't, we just say 5 days, but there's also that uncertainty that's there. And there's external factors and external variables that could cause it not to be 5 days, the quality of the crew or the timing of the resources that you can get on site. So I like to use the example a lot of times when you ask someone, doing your driveway, how long will it take to do your driveway? They don't give you an exact day. They'll give you kind of a duration, or, it might take 8 to 10 days.
Yeah, a
You
range.
have your uncertainty in there.
Yeah.
So we take that and, that's called kind of your 3-point estimate. You get your most likely, your optimistic, your your pessimistic, and your most likely case. So we take that and then we add our risk factors, whatever risks we have in there, and we run a simulation. And that simulation is theoretical, and it could be run many times, whatever you want duration, 100 times, 500 times, 1,000 times, and it'll say, okay, one time it might hit 5 days, the next time it might hit 12 days, the other time it might hit the 8 days. That's the most likely. The most likely is going to probably be hit, coming up a lot. When I say hit, it's kind of running through that simulation, and it's doing different, providing different dates, and they take that and they average it out, so we can kind of get an idea of the duration with the uncertainty and with the risk. And from there, we extract that information to get our contingency budget, and to get our contingency schedule as well. And we tack that on to our budget. So when we present it to leadership or upper management or to the customer, we can say, with X amount of confidence, we can get your project done on the timeline that you wanted. If say it's 200 days, we input all the uncertainties, we input the risks, and we say, we have a 60% chance of hitting 200 days to complete that project.
Right. And it gives you some sort of basis for it other than gut feel, and just say, because I've seen this before and this is what I assume will happen. It does give you that. And not to linger too long on Monte Carlo, and it is a more specialized thing that that is used within risk, but the key inputs, I think the things you need, and you mentioned some of them, is you do need a fair amount of information. You need, the estimates, the best case, worst, optimistic, pessimistic, and expected. You need your risk percentages and so on. So you've got to do a fair amount of homework to get it to work. But as you mentioned, the benefit is to be able to provide those sort of predictions. It also, I think, would be something that would be done on a very high value project. Like, you wouldn't do this for a $2,000 project. You're doing it on a $2 million project or something like that, I would assume.
Yeah, I don't, again, it's not used very often in the smaller jobs, even up to, like, I'd say 5 to 10 million. It's not, if it's a first of a kind, yes, we'll use it. But if it's something, if we're a construction company, we're building, a mid-size, residential building, and we've done it many times. You don't really run the Monte Carlo simulation all the time. But if you think about it, a lot of the power plants right now are going through major component replacement. So they're gutting out the old units and putting brand new parts in it. And their planning is 3-4 years long, and they're looking at those risk factors. That project there would probably go through that Monte Carlo simulation to ensure that they have that contingency, because these are multi-million-dollar projects, infrastructure projects, a lot of government funding, so they need to make sure that they have themselves covered for that.
Yep, you're in the major leagues of risk at that point. Projects. Yeah, I guess my sort of final, or to wrap up my questions, what would you advise someone new coming on your team? You got a new project manager, he's coming on the job site. What do you say to him or her about risk and getting involved in it? And what would be your advice?
Yeah, I think my advice would be just, we have, and we talked about this at the beginning, was, we have that quote unquote boardroom risk that we develop, and we work hard on putting it together. And that is very relevant to what we do. But also there are those risks that are on site due to variables that we spoke about, manpower, or the quality of the material that's on site, the quality of the ground conditions or whatever, because of a rainstorm or a snowstorm. Yeah, so just being aware that there is risk beyond the risk register that we have to take into account. And we just have to make sure that we are following up on those risks that are on that risk register, making sure that we are, crossing them off that list, or if they do happen, using the proper budgeted or allocated funds and schedule contingency to do those. But at the same time, going on site, always looking around for other risks that could pose, issues, be it safety or delays on the project. So just to be, kind of have their eyes open beyond that risk register that's on paper.
Yes. One last, I said final, but there's one more question that I forgot about that I just want to slip in at the end.
Yeah.
You mentioned mitigation. You said the word mitigate, which is, that's in, and there's various risk response strategies. There's mitigate, there's avoid, accept. and so on. What's your what's your most, what if you looked at your average risk register, what are the most worried, which of the risk response do you see there more often? What's the most?
Yeah, I think mitigate is probably the most common response they do. You use avoid, you pass it on to a subcontractor, or you get that insurance to cover you. But even if you do that, you're still responsible. It's almost like you just mitigated it off your, but there is still secondary risks or whatever. So even the avoids turn into mitigates. The only ones really that are either, the one that you kind of just have to deal with is, accept it, like the weather or
Yeah.
anything like that. So yeah, so mitigate's probably the number one thing that you'll see on my risk register. Even avoid is still kind of a mitigate in
Yeah.
disguise type thing.
Yeah, I know what you mean of, and that's good, because that's what I always tell my classes, that mitigate is 98% is, or some huge number, except there's probably a fairly big number, because there's a lot of little ones that we just sort of say, we got to accept it. All we can do is respond to it, like the weather. We have to accept this, that it might rain, and then we then can have contingency. But I know what you mean, that even if you get insurance or transfer the risk, you still have some left over.
Yeah,
It doesn't matter if you have insurance, workman's comp and so on for it, you still have an injury, you still have a delay in your project, so you're still mitigating. So it's all about mitigation.
yeah. Like even if you hire that subcontractor to, pour the concrete instead of your team doing the concrete,
Right.
if anything goes wrong, the owner is going to come after you, and they're not going to come after your subcontractor. So in
Yeah.
essence, it's still you that holds a responsibility, and any risk that goes along with it. Yeah, you can only push along so much of it on a construction site. The buck still stops with you, and you still have to kind of answer to it. And yeah, so you still have to plan for any type of risk activities or high risk activities, even if it's someone else working on it.
Right. Okay. And that was my final question. So, Robert, it's been great talking to you about this topic of risk on a construction site and construction projects, nuclear projects, and so on. It's been extremely interesting, and thank you for sharing your knowledge about this.
Well, thank you for having me, Dave. It was a fun time, and I appreciate all the good questions and all the good discussions.
Yep. All right. Okay. Thanks again, and take care.
That's it for this episode. If you would like to learn more about project management, you can find my book, Understanding Project Management, A Practical Guide, on Amazon. Please also consider following Understanding Projects on your favorite podcast player or clicking subscribe on YouTube.